So that's what we're doing in the middle of our trial right now.
Okay. Any comments from the panelists on the reimbursement issue? And I think it's going to be smooth sailing for Reshape Medical based on what Fred, and I listen to Fred all the time.
Too bad he doesn't sign the
I have a question with regards to reimbursement. And do you recommend companies that are developing similar types of technologies to look at putting together a pharmacoeconomic package in terms of addressing some of the issues that you raised, and specifically looking at potential for less invasive technologies in obesity management for cost savings, both direct and indirect? If it's, for example, going to outpatient, and also looking at some of the costs associated with management of some of the side effects that you see with some of these types of procedures, both in the shorter and longer term. If you could show in some of your studies that you could decrease some of these costs, is that an angle that they could take to drive reimbursement?
Well, yes. I mean, it's definitely very positive if it's less expensive. But for example, the Medicare program, which I suspect is a major payer for these types of procedures, cost is formally not something that's taken into account. So it definitely plays in the background very strongly, but it's not something that you can say that they're going to go with a cheaper procedure. It's not really that simple.
Just maybe to add to that, clearly Medicare is one of the payers, but I think in the obesity world, we're looking at a somewhat younger population in general. So that does change the dynamic some. And from a Reshape perspective, our focus right now is on outcomes and efficacy. Reimbursement in the space in general is an important issue. And what I've heard from some of the payers is long-term sustainable weight loss is what they're going to look at. Plus, our healthcare system today where people can move insurers very quickly. I had an example with a physician in Georgia where one insurer was covering, another wasn't. Their premiums were $25 more a month or whatever, and people would shop for that insurance and get it when they have the procedure and then go back to the cheaper insurances. So there's some challenges there that have to be dealt with, I think, in policy and in terms of society and how we're going to pay for these kinds of procedures.
I think something else I'd like to add is that the type of data that the payers would like to see goes well beyond the kind of data that the FDA requires. So the payers are looking for how these procedures work in the real world under real world average conditions, and how they work in a population which is not under study and not under control. And that kind of data is very difficult to obtain. And so there can be a long period of struggle against the opinion that this is still considered experimental, till the point where you have enough data to convince them that this is going to work. And this is an example of a kind of an area that undergoes particularly strong scrutiny by the payers because there are a lot of patients involved. It's a large patient population, so it has potentially a big impact on their economics. So they tend to be very careful and slow in letting these things in.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to Ken.
One question on this topic. Bill, you put up that slide that said $1.4 trillion are spent, I believe that was today, in this area. What percent of that $1.4 trillion has anything to do with insurance or coverage like we're talking about right now?
Yeah, it's way less, way less than 1%, probably 0.1% of it.
My question on reimbursement is there anything you can do in the process while you're developing your procedure and you're going through clinical studies? Is there anything you can do in the process of sort of predisposing those payers to be more likely to adopt your particular procedure once you get there? In other words, can you open a dialogue? Is there anything you can do to make that more likely?
This is a tricky issue. I think clinical trial design is very important. You can design your trial in a way that starts to answer some of these questions. You're certainly much further along. Otherwise, though, it's difficult. It takes time to get the kind of data that's going to be required. And the other problem is that it's possible to initiate a dialogue with Medicare. They do have, especially if you're coming in with a new technology that might qualify for one of their new technology payments, they're quite willing to talk to you fairly early on. But most of the major payers, the medical directors really don't want to look at anything until it's on the market. That's just their attitude. They don't really have the resources or the time, really, and that's unfortunate. There are technology assessment organizations. They usually take the same attitude, but of course now with the AHRQ getting more funding, there might be some new initiatives that are possible that would get the kind of data maybe faster.
And Dr. Kaufman, you have a comment?
The question you asked about is there a way to help make it so that the payers at the end might pay for it? I think we have to step back and say that no matter how powerful a device or pharmaceutical product is, the patient is still the most important part of the equation. And that patient's behavior turns out to be highly significant as to whether or not a device or medication will work. If you think about what causes obesity or what can help with obesity, you can change someone's genes because there is genetic, you can't do that obviously too much yet, but there's genetic predispositions, there's a lot of physiology that makes you stay obese. That's very difficult to modify. You can change their environment to make healthier foods better, help them be more active. That's not so easy to change. You can get them to medical care, which by the way probably contributes less than 10% of the variance of how people's health gets improved, even with the best devices, or you can work on their behaviors. So I would say that one of the practical realities is that if you're putting together something that is not just the device, but it's actually 5 years later people are going to do well, or 10 years later, understanding how that device fits into the context of that person's life, what behaviors need to be changed, what barriers need to be overcome, what support they need to get, the range of things. And you don't just market and test the single component. That's, to me, a very simplistic way of thinking. Because at the end of it, the clinician in me will say, yeah, it worked for them, but it's not going to work for my patients. Show me how you support all the other aspects of it. And I think the more you can do that as part of your clinical trial to be able to understand how this fits into their life, what side effects they're going to have, how do they mitigate them, how do they overcome barriers, you're going to have now a comprehensive product that's both behaviorally based and surgical or pharmacologically based. And when you put those two together, you've got extraordinary power.
Thank you.
I have actually another comment, though, to the question in terms of trying to understand or increase the probability of getting payer acceptance once a product's in the market. I mean, even though there is a reluctance to have access to the medical directors, what many larger companies do is they do market research. So they'll put together a product profile of a product, and not only do they present this to key opinion leaders and practicing physicians and also consumers to understand how would they use this product, what would they do to really get the outcomes you need in combination, lifestyle modification. They do the same thing with the medical directors in key payer groups. So they'll put together a panel or they'll talk to them individually, show them the profile of a product and go through with them and ask them key questions in terms of this type of product, what would they need to see for reimbursement, what type of clinical data, what type of long-term data, what type of other activities or lifestyle modification or whatever it may be that they would see in terms of reimbursement, what type of tiering would they put in their reimbursement. So